Probably recording already. So, yeah, hello everyone. Welcome to today's meeting of the Oxford's Modernizing Criminology discussion group. Today we're pleased to welcome Dr. Roxana Pessoa Cavalcanti, who presents her fantastic research on Brazil. Her talk today is titled Lessons from a Study of Violence and Policing in Brazil. And we're just delighted to have Roxana kindly joining our group today and sharing her work with us. So thanks very much, Roxana, for accepting our invitation. Carla will briefly introduce our speaker and quickly remind you of some practicalities before handing over to Roxana.
Hello, everyone. So Dr. Roxana Pessoa Cavalcanti is a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Brighton, where she co-leads the Cities, Injustice and Resistance Research Group. She has been an active member of criminological societies and international networks, including the Urban Violence Research Network, the Feminist Urban Violence Research Collective, which she co-founded, the Criminalizing Dissent Network, British Society of Criminology, and the European Group for the Study of Deviance and Social Control. Her book, published in Routledge in 2020, examines the governance of violent relations in Brazil. So we are very pleased to have Dr. Pessoa Cavalcanti today with us. Just a couple of practicalities. As you have seen, this session is being recorded. The recording will stop for the Q&A, and then we would really kindly ask you as much as possible to turn on your cameras, maybe, so that we can have a better discussion, everyone connected together. That will be all on my part. So please, Roxana, go ahead, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Luis and Carla for the invitation. It's an honor to present my research to a student-led collective. So thank you so much all for attending. Let me just see if I can share my slides with you. Can everybody see that?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so, my research on violence, youth and policing and insecurity in urban Brazil, it speaks to some of the themes of this series, which builds on the theoretical, methodological and philosophical tools to make sense of the periphery and its relations with research that are made in the Global South. So I want to start about speaking a little bit about the work that has inspired me. One thing to say about this work is that, post-colonial and decolonial thinking sheds light on the racial, gendered, and class dynamics of Brazilian society that are part of the aftermath and ongoing nature of imperialist, capitalist, worldwide relations. So inspired by the work of some key Brazilian thinkers, including Abdias Nascimento and Lélia Gonzalez, I want to briefly sketch a critique of the intensification of carceral relations in Brazil, drawing on the examples from my ethnographic research. So violence, as many before me have argued, is a multifaceted polysemic phenomenon. It's associated with structural processes of urbanization, entrenched socioeconomic inequalities, dispossession of those whose lives are not deemed worthy, weaponization, proliferation of firearms and drugs markets, and many other factors. So before I go any further, the first thing to say is that by adopting a Southern perspective, I'm not thinking about the South as a geographical location. Instead, I'm thinking about the South in relation to the North. So I propose to use the idea of the South in terms of relationality. For me, Southern, post-colonial and decolonial perspectives share plenty in common. In fact, understanding coloniality and the colonial matrix of power, as these ideas relate to criminological problems, is essential for the advancement of knowledge that can disrupt the imperial origins of the discipline and disobey its current mainstream applications too. Post-colonial theory from its outset has been concerned with the production of social, cultural, political, and spatial knowledge in light of colonialism and imperialism. Post-colonial, with a hyphen, denotes a time period after the end of formal colonial rule, the end of flag planting. But if colonialism implies the occupation of territories and expropriation of resources, the violent and coercive imposition of political and economic systems and ideologies, dispossession of lands from indigenous peoples, the slavery and economic accumulation under the pretense of developing and civilizing, then post-colonial implies a world shaped and influenced by the legacies of imperialism and colonial rule that are still with us today. So the work of Edward Said, Orientalism, and parallel discussions in decolonial thinking are fundamental in this discussion. Post-colonialism, as a dialectics of learning from the marginal and the marginalized, is concerned with mechanisms through which colonial power, hierarchies, and inequalities are enabled and maintained. It is concerned with the problem of silence and the question of violence of imperialism. In this respect, I think of the city as a central part of the spatiality of imperialism, as Kowarek and Jacobs have shown us in their work. So central to this discussion is, as the Spivak says, the task of reversing, displacing, and seizing the apparatus of value coding. This is because there are masked universalisms in knowledge production and ongoing processes of colonization and the violence of dispossession. Post-colonial experiences are material, current, and tangible. As Gurminder Bambra put it, we need to consider the emergence of the modern world in the broader histories of colonialism, empire, and enslavement, and the radical potential in unsettling and reconstituting the standard processes of knowledge production. So with this in mind, let's think about the problem with criminology and mainstream criminological solutions to crime. At the heart of criminology is the construction of otherness, danger, and what constitutes crime. As Anna Liverti and colleagues neatly put in a recent paper, decolonization did not dismantle the colonial roots of the cultural, social, and political mechanisms informing contemporary punishment. Critical scholars have traced the continuity of imperialism in the development of criminal justice, excavating how colonialism produced lasting patterns of social hierarchies, such as the creation of racial categories through imperial conquest, imposing coercion, subordination, and the adoption of crime control institutions and practices as forms of incorporation of apparent modernity, development, or civilization. So when we propose criminal justice solutions, we have to ask, solutions for whom? Who is being pacified, policed, controlled, protected? Understanding metropolitan thinking, as Kono argued, is essential for developing more inclusive knowledge and useful scholarship. Here I quote Kono, who noted that social science succeeded in representing itself and being widely accepted as universal, timeless, and placeless. According to this logic, social phenomena in the periphery would be investigated from the standpoint of universal theories and laws of development generated in modern or Western societies in the global north. The South could be mined for data as for other raw materials, and empirical studies might be conducted in Southern settings, applying imported Northern theory, but little in the way of novel ideas or theoretical insights of anything more than local interest to be yielded from the social scientific enterprise in the South, end quote. So Kono has shown how selective misunderstandings of race and difference, now elevated to the level of knowledge production, reinforced colonial modernist metropolitan racism at precisely the time that social science was first taking recognizable shape. At its birth, and often in its mainstream visions, criminology, allied with other disciplines and eugenics movements, poses central positivistic concerns with causes and solutions to crime, presuming the existence of salvage criminals. Expropriation, exploitation, and segregation, left enduring imprints on all colonial settler societies. As Biko Agostinho reminds us, that criminology as a discipline is closely tied to the project of colonization and patriarchal imperialism as a science designed for the control of others. Criminology remains embedded with the state power structures, and therefore control freak criminologists are more likely to resist the ongoing decolonization of theory, methodology, and especially policy. If we think historically, many of the key issues we face today have colonial roots. So take, for example, the problems of militarization and authoritarianism, fresh in our minds as a disastrous new war takes place. Colonizers drew on militarized practices and strategies to facilitate appropriation and subjugation. This occurred through the Jesuit missions, which served the Portuguese and Spanish crowns, for example. In Brazil, the flag planters, or bandeirantes, as they were known in Portuguese, served as militarized militias and an emerging militarized population during colonization and wars over the creation of borders. At this time, the idea of race, which is another construction with colonial roots, as an ideology provided the rationale for exploitation. Institutions such as the Encomenda had feudal origins that refer to servitude. These institutions of exploitation and servitude were created with the aim of dividing the indigenous population and civilizing them, or converting them to Christianity. Both encomendados and those enslaved were submitted to brutal forms of violence, kept captive, inherited, or transferred as if they were property. You know, slaves provided the labor and sweat that was transferred as wealth to Europe and European colonizers, as Fanon and Walter Rodney so clearly demonstrated in their work. Such as forms of extraction are continuing and visible processes. For example, Brazil's President Bolsonaro's, an allegedly democratic government, has appointed the largest number of military ministers and military government officials since the last dictatorship in Brazil, which was between 1964 and 1985. Similarly, during the COVID crisis, Brazil's ex-minister for the environment, Ricardo Salles, defended the use of the crisis as a unique opportunity to change environmental regulations in order to facilitate the passing of the boiada, the cattle raising, within previously protected indigenous territories. So in this context, the Brazilian philosopher Marilena Chauí argued that many myths persist in Brazilian society that allow for the continuation and reproduction of violence and oppression. One of these myths is the myth of nonviolence, the idea that Brazil has a cordial, sensual, and racially democratic society. You know, since the 1980s, the reality is that Brazil has seen a significant growth in urban violence, you know, which placed the nation in the ranking of the countries with the world's highest homicide rates. And this is demonstrated in the work of many, many Brazilian academics, Adorno, Sala, Rangel, Hatton, Zalua, many others. That the growth of lethal violence and the fear that it provokes have been some of the most alarming and devastating changes for Brazilian society since the 1980s. In this context, the process of securitization inherent in attempts to allegedly control violence has had significant impacts on marginalized and poor young people. On the topic of violence, I've already hinted that violence has many forms and meanings. It is a structural issue. Many authors have questioned the correlation of violence with poverty. Homicide rates correlate to inequality of income, not poverty per se. There's also the issue of geographic vulnerability, you know, that Brazil has a long coastline shared with many producers of coca, so it has permeability to drug trafficking and organized crime. An important issue is that in Latin America, you know, firearms have become easily accessible and widespread. So some have linked the fast urbanization, the fast urban population growth with rising homicides. But homicide rates have also been linked with the proportion of people in slums, in research, for example, by Roenick. Other factors in this context include the fact that criminal justice groups can buy protection from authorities, from the police, from the judiciary, while the most marginalized endure the circumstances of routine violence. But more important, are the conditions that maintain inequalities, such as regressive forms of taxation combined with social insecurities, privatization of public goods that takes assets, public assets, straight into the coffers of corporations, as the work, for example, of José Sousa has argued. There's also the issue of unemployment. So, for example, between 1979 and 1998, there was a quintupling of youth unemployment, and this is simultaneous to a rise in homicide rates from 8 to 66 per 100,000 in that same period, as shown in research by Mir. So all of this, linked with the issues of militarization and mass incarceration, produce a toxic cycle of criminalization and reproduction of violence. In this context of high levels of violence, a new security program was implemented in Pernambuco in 2007, where I did my field work. This program was known as Pact for Life. So in Recife, during the government of Eduardo Campos, the securitization agenda was grouped together under the project Pact for Life. So over 100 projects were proposed, including police reforms, the creation of specialized police stations for certain groups, such as the elderly, women, LGBT groups, children, young people, disarmament projects, social and education projects, etc. Their alleged aim was to reduce mortality in the state of Pernambuco. It was in the context of hyper-armed violence that the program of police reform and public security Pact for Life emerged. But most of its social interventions were neglected in the implementation process, while the more neoliberal and repressive measures gained momentum. So Pact for Life was a securitization program. It was founded on the idea that crime can be managed and even prevented if we focus on reducing opportunities for crime through deterrence, policing, and incarceration. So some examples of mainstream criminological theories that fall into these traps of metropolitan thinking are broken windows theories, situational crime prevention. So these theories have been used to promote managerial criminology around the globe, from Comstat in New York to Pact for Life in Recife, as I argue today, regardless of their applicability and regardless of their perverse outcomes. Brazil's proponents of managerialism have often misread and misunderstood homicide reduction programs from the global north, such as Operation Ceasefire. These authors incorrectly interpret the central element of ceasefire as the increasing rates of incarceration. So here you can look at, for example, the work of Veloso and Ferreira in 2008. And some seem to believe that Comstat and crime management technologies could make the Brazilian police more accountable or reduce crime. This is, for example, in the work of Soares, which I cite in the book as well. And this really shows little awareness of the established critiques of managerialism, the established critiques of Comstat and the New York miracle. So the dominant managerial success discourse is disconnected from the voices of people in low-income communities. The overall feedback from people in these case study communities revealed dissatisfaction with the state and with the type of security and policing that is provided. While technocrats, may argue that the only type of data that can truly convey results are statistics about actual crime rates, this dismisses the importance of what actually happens on the ground at community level. Statistical reductions in homicide may look good on paper, but they do not mean that the police are less violent and brutal in these communities. Neither do they truly represent reductions in violence. What these policy changes show are wider shifts that reinforce the links between criminalization and institutional racism, as Chris Canyon has argued. The debate around neoliberalization is complex in the Brazilian case, so for reasons of time, I will leave this for the discussion if anyone wants to talk about this further. But one thing to say is that modernization of criminal justice institutions and this business model, that, as we can see in this quote here from an interviewee, were central to the Pact for Life public security intervention. These changes in policy and practice had multiple effects. One effect of this change in policy and practice was the exacerbation of mass incarceration. So, as Paul Wamar noted, when security logics come to serve as the articulating hub for governance and social political discourse, this process is called securitization. Securitization refers to the reformation and reconstruction of political discourses and ideas around social justice and participation into technocratic operations of control, management, and targeting of dangerous populations. Any account of the development of notions of security and the politics of crime, violence, and control has to be grounded in the underlying structural and historical context in which such concepts and ideas are embedded. The ontology of crime and danger is fluid. It's contested, it mutates at different times in history. And so do the meanings of and uses and misuses of the notions of security and what constitutes violence. Harsher and even more efficient criminal justice policies and practice have differential impacts on marginalized communities. As Carrington and many others have warned us, the criminal justice system, as a normalized presence in the life of entire communities, affects their demographics, social fabric, family structure, intergenerational relationships, political economy, and fosters spirals of criminalization. As a process, criminalization has always been selective, disproportionately impacting on those with fewer resources, such as economic, political, and legal resources. As a process, it has continuity, just as the growth in mass incarceration that has occurred in Brazil, even in within so-called progressive governments of the time. So there was, of course, resistance to these processes and these changes. So in my case study in Brazil, the initial kind of softer human security proposals for community conflict resolution programs in this new securitization program known as Pact for Life were very quickly diluted, not implemented, not prioritized. So email correspondences, for example, with workers involved in the administration of the public security system indicate that conflict resolution has not been implemented. So the views of these workers indicate that there is much disappointment with the effects of Pact for Life on mass incarceration. Moreover, as we see in this quote from an interviewee in the communities that I did my research, residents of those low-income communities had many complaints about cases of disrespect, of abuse of their human rights on the part of the police. Police violence remains widespread in Brazil, and homicide data do not reflect the cases of non-lethal violence where the victim survives, such as rape, gender violence, police abuse of force. The residents felt distance from the police when they needed help or when they needed emergency services, but when they interacted with the police, those encounters were adversarial and reflected enduring problems of disrespect for the rights of poor, indigenous, and Afro-descendant people. Can we have hope for the future? This is a difficult question. The specialist in public security, Inácio Cano, makes an important point, arguing that, although demilitarizing the police would be beneficial, demilitarizing the entire public security apparatus and its policies is essential if we are to reduce police violence. This could entail, for instance, less involvement of military personnel in policy making and implementation, signaling the end of the army involvement in public security matters, the end of military training, the end of military hierarchy, and the end of a military justice system. But what we see is something else. What we see is what Agostino explained as, when criminologists break the silence to glance at developing countries, the same crime control models that have failed in the West and in settler colonial locations are being exported to the developing countries and to indigenous peoples as the made for export criminology that Stanley Cohen dismissed for being allied to imperialism. So to understand what's happening today, we cannot separate ourselves from our historical context. What I want us to think about is the role of colonialism and coloniality, for example, as illustrated by the continuation of militarization, authoritarianism, and mass incarceration. Many authors, Campos, Macaulay, Carvalho, for example, explained that, Brazilian legislators in the 1990s contributed to the expansion of the prison population with the creation of new crimes. That's the extension of criminalization. And the limitation of rights in the execution of sentences, which reduced the number of inmates who could leave the prison system. So a noteworthy example of this development was the creation of Act 8072/90, which increased punishment, withdrew progressive sentencing, increased the term for parole, and obstructed the commutation and pardon for crimes known as heinous crimes. And these crimes include now drug trafficking. So, these new forms of security, these new laws, these new methods of criminalization have all contributed to exacerbate the disproportionate criminalization of the poor, of racialized communities, while neglecting their needs and their own victimization. So what we have is this result now. We have Brazil as the third largest prison population in the world, with 811,707 people in prison. And this continuing militarization process. So just to wrap up, really, this work has been an attempt to engage with the perceptions of marginalized people through radical research, to contribute to the emerging body of literature that's developing solvent theories and a solvent criminological approach through an engagement with knowledge produced by academics in the South, and an engagement with the perceptions of underrepresented groups in civil society, namely, young people, Afro-descendants people that live in low-income neighborhoods. This work, is a critique of mainstream criminological theories developed in the global North and emulated or inadequately applied in the global South. Drawing on the data from two case study communities in the peripheries of Recife, the city in the northeast of Brazil, I've briefly glanced over the critique of securitization that I present in my book. This is based on the voices of people in marginalized communities, which are the epicenter of multiple intersecting forms of social inequalities. The interviews with residents, mostly, although not all young, aged between 16 and 29, revealed that militarized policing, alongside the continuity, neglectful, criminalizing, and violent methods of control, exacerbates inequalities and mass incarceration. While securitization programs focused on numerical targets, such as homicide, did not address wider forms of violence, including structural, symbolic, and non-lethal violence. The claims of reduced numbers of homicides were good for political campaigns. The modes of securitization in the city did very little to resolve actual insecurity and marginalization in these communities, which saw ever younger children join the drug trade and ordinary residents criminalized by racist, sexist, and classist policing practices. So this work provides a critique of dominant technocratic discourse of successful securitization presented in the media, in the narratives of state actors, especially high-ranking government actors. And this discourse is even seen, within some academic circles as well. What this shows is that, as Eleni Dimoy argued in a recent paper, that, criminology plays a central role in pathologizing, demonizing, criminalizing, disciplining, and governing colonized and non-Western populations, Now, we can add that it plays a central role in the legitimation of institutions of repression that maintain interlocking systems of oppression alive. This includes the legitimation of authority, coercion, criminalization, and punishment. It should come as no surprise that the criminal justice system is a mechanism to exert power, operating to maintain social hierarchies. Lessons from this work can be applied beyond Brazil, since other countries face similar issues, including countries attempting to make their institutions more democratic or transitioning from authoritarian rule, or suffering high crime and inequality rates, growing vigilantism, or similar security issues. Securitization and mainstream solutions to violence or crime, or those that become implemented, such as managerial reforms, can be understood as part of broader shifts in social control, with comparable developments found in many other countries. The effects of these developments and the risks they pose vary according to the socioeconomic context and the history of each place. They impact on populations differently through the exacerbation of social inequalities, the deterioration of police-community relations, the development of problematic prison complexes, the further organization of criminal groups, the additional erosion of public spaces, safety and human rights, all of which become permissible in the agenda of securitizing through particular forms of crime control. Now, here we must be attentive to how the category race is a strategic essentialism used by the powerful, not only to express status, but also to criminalize and racialize. This can also be a means to organize and resist power for those who have been racialized. And I have here this beautiful picture of a piece of artwork from about Zeferina and João de Deus Nascimento, resistance leaders in Brazil. So, we cannot escape thinking about, how colonialism left enduring social divisions and that have led to catastrophic social consequences today, including the escalating criminalization and imprisonment of indigenous and previously enslaved people. Yet, criminology and the social sciences in the North often neglect the importance of imperialism and colonialism in analysis and theories. So, global North theories and concepts have been inappropriately generalized to the South, while diverse histories, politics, cultures, and socioeconomic contexts in criminal justice practices have been marginalized. So, Southern experiences have been dismissed. But there is now new promising work on Southern and decolonial perspectives beginning to address these problems. So for me, this is the beginning of a dialogue. It's not the end point of a dialogue. Thank you all very much. I end here.